So most of this conference has been about proving IP in the context of litigation, and changing IP laws in the context of common law and judicial opinions. But we've been largely overlooking the fact that all of that happens within the construct of statutes, and thinking about what the ground rules are as they come down from various legislatures. And so I'm excited for this last panel to really talk about other ways of thinking about the rules and the structures that govern proving IP, and other ways to change those rules besides directly through the court. So with that, please join me in welcoming the final panel today on proving IP, proving reform.
Yep. All right, thank you. So I'm Professor Jason Schultz. I'm one of the Engelberg Center co-directors, but I also run a technology law and policy clinic here as part of the clinical program, and I was also one of the co-directors of the Samuelson Technology Law and Public Policy Clinic at Berkeley before I came here. And one of the interesting things that I get when we have kind of the student clinic fair and all the students are shopping around for what they want to do with maybe their second or third year of law school is they say, what's the difference between law and policy, right? And it's a really interesting question, right? It's a fun conversation, but one of the things that I love about it is talking to law students and lawyers and people, especially those who cared passionately about improving the status of the world more broadly, is, what are the possibilities of policy to change the world, right? And what are the mechanisms of doing that, and how do you get it done, right? And so what I'm particularly excited about for this panel is to kind of, indulge in that question for a moment around questions related to intellectual property. And I say related in the sense that many of the issues that our guests on the panel or speakers will talk about have an IP component to them, but also are part of a broader set of thinking about social welfare and the benefits of, why have IP at all, kind of to begin with. So I'm going to allow each speaker to introduce themselves. It's something I believe, me reading off a sheet is not very good, but I'm going to prompt each one to kind of go down and talk one by one about a reform issue, policy reform, one or two things that they have worked on personally. Kind of talk a little bit about what drove them to get involved, and also what proof did they feel they needed to bring to the table to get it done. And when I say proof, kind of the way of thinking about this, similar to the kind of frame of the overall conference of assume the doctrine is the doctrine, and assume the judicial system is the judicial system. What do you need to bring to the party, as proof? And so if we're going to assume that the political system is the political system we have, and not argue that we should change the political system itself, we assume there's money, there's lobbying, there's these kind of things. But when you want to advocate for policy reform in these areas, what do you need to muster? What do you need to bring, gather? And then how is that effective to try to prove your points or to try to push your agenda? So we're going to start off with Amy Kapczynski, who is a law professor at Yale and has done several different amazing projects to work on reform around this, and I'm going to let her talk about something that's very much in the news these days.
Great, thanks so much for having me. It's a real treat to be here. And by way of introducing myself, I work on intellectual property, particularly in the pharmaceutical domain, also regulatory law increasingly, and I would say broadly both questions of health justice and political economy. So the things I've been involved in that I thought I might touch on in given Jason's question, are efforts to address high drug prices, so both legislatively, because I've been involved in a lot of those recently, but also efforts to get the executive to take action given the set of rights that it has, both background rights like Section 1498, but also recently, actually yesterday, worked on a hearing that the House Oversight Committee had about a drug called Truvada, where the CDC actually holds a key patent right that it could use to bring the prices down. So that's another area of a kind of avenue for high drug price advocacy that I've worked on. And then there's been a variety of things I've done to work on the transparency and quality of clinical trial data. So in thinking about sort of how data is used and evidence is used in these different fora and different kinds of policy debates, the sort of first question that you asked us to think about is like, is data important? And I think it has been in all of those areas. And it's been most important. I would say it's had the most effect. When we think of evidence in the way that scholars do, and data the way that scholars do, in areas where there's sort of political agreement, right? So in the drug pricing area, we've got a kind of political settlement about the length of patent terms and about, sort of antitrust. And so evidence about REMS abuse and evergreening and pay for delay and sham citizen petitions, all these kinds of things have actually had a lot of impact, and we've seen a lot of things that I think will maybe go through this, in the next cycle or two, to sort of, again, these are not huge, in a way, shifts in the drug pricing landscape, but they're areas where evidence and a lot of the work that academics have done has in fact had a lot of impact. And as academics, we're constantly being asked to advise on legislation of those sorts, and evidence matters. I think there's a whole other set of kind of bigger political questions about, how much do we want to bring drug prices down? How much do we want to address the real political question of sort of the shape of incentives in this area? That's a lot harder, and I think evidence matters less. You get into deep ideological questions about like how to think about the market and the state, at least it gets written ideologically. I would say that conversation too is being driven, but I would say less by evidence than by a lot of very personal stories. So when you go to DC now and you talk to almost any congressperson about insulin, like they're extraordinarily interested in insulin. And that is in part because there have been extraordinary stories about individuals in the United States who've died because they couldn't afford their insulin, because the price of insulin has gone up 400 times in the last 10 years, although the drugs are old, right? So those kind of personal stories are extraordinarily important as evidence, but obviously of a much different kind, and that can help shift the political dynamics, I think, too. So I could say, I don't want to go on too long, but on this work about clinical trial data, there's a lot of, again, I think, role for evidence. There's a huge medical literature about the problems in clinical trial data and about the need for more transparency in clinical trial data. We've been working to try to connect that up with the regulatory process. The FDA has actually made a number of changes to make data more accessible. Where companies really resist that, the FDA resists it too, and so there we've been working on litigation and trying to actually get data out of FOIA and other kinds of things to try to create a better evidence base for whether drugs work and are effective. That's really hard, and this gets to some of the problems of the use of data to change law or policy, which is to say, in this context, we're trying to prove in both a macro level and an immediate case, right, that there's a lot of public interest in this data being available and that there aren't very strong commercial arguments for keeping it secret. But that's actually really hard and really like resource intensive to prove in any particular case. And that has to do with, in some sense, how capacious the arguments that companies can make about their commercial interests and how hard those are to disprove, how fact intensive that fight is. So I guess I'll just say then, like, a couple of maybe broader things about what I think about the dynamics of evidence and policymaking. So one is just that a lot of the problems are political, and evidence is, of sort of less, it does less work, I think, when the questions are, for example, like, should we have a drug pricing kind of system that prioritizes access for people who, are poor? That's like a political question about which, we have to make political decisions. But the other is that I think we need to think also about evidence production and its political economy itself. Like, it takes so much work to produce evidence. And in some sense, one of the background problems that I thought is worth mentioning is that a lot of these areas of law were set up without evidence to begin with. And then those of us that want to change them have to produce a lot of evidence to change them, right? And it's like, where was the evidence that we needed a 20-year patent term, or that we needed, formulation patents, or that we needed, data exclusivity? Like, where was there was not really an evidence base for all of those moves, and yet trying to move it, you often get, asked for, now ironclad evidence that this is not going to impact innovation in a negative way, or, that dynamic, I think the kind of way that the baselines are set. So who has to have evidence and who already sort of gets to take advantage of the law as it exists that was not created with evidence in the first place is just something that we have to think about. It's an issue too in these cases about like corporate confidentiality and clinical trial data. Do we have to prove that there's benefit and not commercial harm to get that data, or does the company have to prove that there is not, I mean, like, and the setup is much harder for us to prove that the confidential corporate data is valuable and is not going to be of any commercial consequence than it is for the company to prove. So like thinking about those baselines, I think, is really important.
Yeah, just the one thing I think we've heard through the whole conference is this connection between what it means to prove something and who has the burdens of which part of that. One thing I just want to ask real quick before we move to Dave is you mentioned academics, and one of the things that I've noticed about your work is the interdisciplinary nature of it outside of law. And I just wondered if you wanted to talk for just 1 second about what have you learned from some of these efforts about working across different disciplines, and how important is it or not? Because I think, there is this tendency, I think, in law schools to be like, well, here's the answer, and, push, but then, it's obviously a lot more work. And we talked about the amount of work to create the evidence. It's also a lot of work to create interdisciplinary, coalitions of even academics alone to kind of agree on what a reform might look like.
Yeah, I mean, I think I do a lot of work with people in the health sciences particularly, and we'll work for years on papers sometimes that are generating original data sets or analyzing data because of their value and I think that's useful for them because they don't know how to ask questions in a way that's relevant to policy debates often, and it's useful to me because it helps bring evidence to policy debates. That said, I think that like lawyers get disparaged as not being sufficiently sort of technically sophisticated, either about economic arguments or about data, and I think to me, that's a problem because there are underlying things that we're actually pretty good at thinking about, which are how institutions work, how politics works, how law works, and then balancing lots of different kinds of interests that can't all be cashed out through one lens, right? And so, I think we also bring important things to the table that we need to not be, I think, too
deferential.
Too deferential to, or just not acknowledge, right? That actually lots of laws aren't built around the question, what's most efficient? And so if they're built around the question of what's good faith, then you need, not necessarily, those are not necessarily technical questions or questions that are supposed to be answered by somebody in, a medical school or economics department. They might be questions that ought to be answered by people who have the kind of styles of reasoning that we do.
Great. Well, we'll come back to this. So Dave Kappos, as most of you may know, was for a while the head of the Patent Office, but was heavily involved both before that and ongoing with efforts and questions around patent reform. In general, and specifically the American Invents Act. Would you walk us through, from sort of your personal perspective, some of the lessons learned and takeaways from some of your various efforts in that realm?
Okay, thanks, Jason. And a pleasure to be here at NYU and to participate. I love the fact that a topic, data and intellectual property, as Amy, I think, correctly points out, was not something that would have been on anyone's agenda 10 years ago, certainly not 20 years ago, but now we've got a whole conference organized around it, so thanks to the folks here at NYU for doing that. I think it is tremendously important, and we've come a long way. So my perspective, partially coming from my time inside government, trying to influence policy using data, and partly coming from my efforts from outside government doing that, frankly, mostly on a pro bono basis, is that indeed a lot has changed, and a lot has changed for the positive. And I take the point that Amy makes that a lot of these laws didn't come into place based on data, and now, in order to fix problems, whether it's on the side of trying to ensure that the IP laws and their interpretations are not too strong, or on the side of trying to ensure that they are strong enough, we find ourselves being confronted with where's the data, and it is an interesting new dynamic. What has changed, though, in my view, from inside the government, is that we finally became focused on putting people in place and collecting data and talking about it and putting effort into it. And it actually all started, in my view, in the latter part of the Bush administration, when the USPTO was first given the mandate to create an office of the chief economist. That never existed before. There never was any recognition of the need to tie the intellectual property system to economic outcomes, inputs, outputs, and et cetera. And it was at the same time that WIPO, the UN IP agency in Geneva, put its first chief economist in place in the same time that the EPO, the European Patent Office, did the same. And so one of the things that I got to do when I got into the government was put a chief economist in place, and we did that. And that then led to a number of things, including conferences with economists, not lawyers, not patent people, not trademark people, not copyright people, but economists. It led to bringing economists into the agency on stints, if you will, on sabbaticals. It led to what I think has become known as the Industries in Motion study that was done jointly between the USPTO and the Department of Commerce, which has a lot of great statistics. First time ever that an effort was made to get the data to show how intellectual property intensive industries contribute or don't to the US economy. It was so good that the Europeans did the same study, and then we did the study again 3 years later so we could measure change over time. So there were, in my view, big changes that have occurred, starting with this fundamental recognition on the part of the legislature, signed into law by the president, that economics needs to play a role and data needs to play a role. So that's the sort of the comment I'd make from inside. The comment I'd make from outside, Jason, is that I do agree, as someone who spends a lot of time with members of Congress, speaking with them and their staff, all on a pro bono basis. I don't represent anyone when I do that, that anecdotes continue to play well and to have a lot of sway. We refer, inside the Beltway, we refer to anecdata. And it can be a little dangerous at times because, you know, you can find a story to stand for any point of view or any proposition, and that doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. But by the same token, let me give you a couple of examples where data has started to play a role in a particularly pernicious and challenging area. This is the Patent Act and the statutory subject matter struggles that we're having, what we call Section 101. And it was, in fact, recently, the study by Dave Schwartz that probably many in this room have seen, that has actually, for the first time that I know of, gone out and done the hard legwork to actually interview people who tie the patent system to economic outcomes, venture capitalists, private equity, you know, those kinds of folks, and say, so how is the patent system affecting your decision making? And Dave learned a lot, published that in a great study, a lot of great data came out there. The other example I'll give, and that study is being cited now in Congress, being used in the discussion, in the debate, and is finally enabling us to say, in fairness, that patents have a strong correlation with investment decisions in some areas, think healthcare, and they actually don't have so strong a correlation with investment decisions in other areas, think software. You know, a lot of us, including myself, suspected that for a long time. Now we're getting some evidence of it. The one other thing I'll mention is that, you know, in the international area, this is something I was personally involved in when I was asked by a senator why any of his colleagues would care about the fact that Section 101 and its constrained interpretation in the US could be setting our patent system back. And I answered, I think it's true that you can now get a patent for computer software or life sciences in the diagnostics area more readily in the People's Republic of China than you can in the United States of America. And he said, okay, well, that would definitely be interesting to my colleagues. Can you get data to support that? So I went out and I got the data to support that, and it required a lot of bone grinding work. People in this room know how retail that is. You got to actually study hundreds of patents and read their file histories and separate false positives and all the garbage to curate data sets. We did it, and we were able to show that indeed it has become clearly easier to get a patent in China or Europe on certain areas of software and healthcare diagnostics than in the US. That led to a study that was presented to Congress, again, based on data, and I think that has made its way through the debate and is having an impact because it's hard to argue with data. So just a few examples, both from inside and outside the government. Data does matter, and we're getting better at it.
Great. So Chris, why don't you weigh in from your perspective and also talk maybe a little bit about public knowledge as a DC-based group and in some ways maybe even about the, you know, this anecdata question I think is interesting from your point of view since a lot of the issues that you work on have to deal with the anecdata of the entire internet to some degree, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. First, thanks for having me here. I've loved being here these last 2 days, hearing amazing speakers and really smart attorneys. I'm not an attorney. I'm a lobbyist, or as we say in the public interest community, I'm an advocate. My job is to advocate for what we think the law should be, where I really have enjoyed 2 days of hearing, analysis of what the law is and how to make hard decisions based on it. But because, in policymaking, because I think it's based on what the law should be, it really is amorphous, and it boils down to being able to convince people to agree with you for their own reasons. And I think David's last story about China and IP is an example. If you start with the question of well, what's going to move my colleague to agree with me on this? It might not be for my reasons, but it might be for their own reasons. That's a lot of what we try to do in our advocacy. There's a real hierarchy in my mind of what works when you're proving that something should be reformed, when you're proving that when the law should be structured in a specific way. It starts with the data about what is correct and what is incorrect. Before I came to Public Knowledge, and we've been around since about 2001 as a public interest advocacy group, and we've really cut our teeth on both intellectual property and broadband policy. I came from the broadband policy side, and I worked in the Federal Communications Commission. That agency is, like a lot of agencies, is dominated by engineers and lawyers. And as neither, I made friends with the engineers because the technical knowledge and the data, always comes first. And when I left the Federal Communications Commission and went to Public Knowledge, we were just coming off of the 2011-2012 SOPA-PIPA legislative fight, and I think there were some background materials that were on the website. One of them was Yochai Benkler's description of that campaign, and it's a phenomenal. There's great charts in there of where you could find articles at different points in that 2-year campaign online describing why folks on our side were concerned about that law moving forward. But there were 2 things that moved that debate to stop that legislation. Number one was the data that was presented by engineers and experts who understand how communications networks work, how the internet works, and what introducing certain sorts of checks or certain sorts of filters would have on the structure and the functioning of the internet. And those were the engineers. And the first time I heard of SOPA-PIPA was when I was at the FCC, when folks from our Department of Engineering came up to me as a legislative guy and said, "Hey, are you following this bill?" And I said, "No, I'm not. Tell me about it." And they broke that down for me. And then we proceeded to see that in some of the congressional hearings, up to the point where when we really started to build momentum, you had congressmen like Jason Chaffetz saying openly at hearings, "We've got to get the nerds in the room to explain how this thing works." So data is extremely important, but it doesn't always trump things. Jason and I were talking before, and he was saying, "Okay, we understand, as you said in your opening, there's money and there's lobbying. Let's not just talk about money and lobbying. I'm a lobbyist. Money and lobbying is important." And different folks will have different anecdotes or anecdata, and how do you balance that, or how do you prove your argument against someone else's anecdotes or anecdata? And so what I think comes out ahead of money and lobbying, and this is where good policy making happens, and therefore good policy reform happens, is that when what trumps it is people. We saw that in SOPA-PIPA, certainly the blackouts, the internet blackouts that grabbed the attention of legislators who hadn't heard that was a problem yet. When that happened in January 2012, it really stopped that legislation cold. It doesn't have to be in a negative effect, though. In 2013 and 2014, I had the pleasure of working on a really small bill that dealt with the 1201 procedures of the triennial review process at the Copyright Office. And it all spun up because for the first time after 3 consecutive triennial reviews, the Copyright Office decided to make it illegal to unlock your mobile device in order to move it to another network. And that just struck at the core of people's values in a way that we didn't expect. Public knowledge, we will monitor policy, we'll write about it. But it was amazing to see, as we started to write about it, how many people grabbed onto this idea that, wait a minute, I paid for this device, I own it. And in a digital era, does ownership have the same value that it used to in an analog era? Those are important values to people. And so it led to hundreds of thousands of people signing a petition saying that they wanted that decision overturned. Now, they didn't know where that decision could be overturned, and we ended up passing a small, narrow bill that overturned the decision of the Copyright Office. But it took galvanizing people's stories and their understanding of certain values. People and values trump money and lobbying. It's hard to galvanize and it's hard to organize, but if reform is important enough, it has to be communicated in a way that presents those values to average Americans in order to speak up and overcome what could be a well-funded lobbying effort by someone who may or may not be correct on what values should hold sway in policymaking. So that's kind of my hierarchy is it right or wrong technically? Do you have the money and the organization to lobby? But if you don't, how do you get folks to talk about values in a way that impacts policymaking? One more anecdote, if I could.
Sure.
We saw this recently at Public Knowledge when we worked on the MMA, the Music Modernization Act, which I didn't really get to spend a lot of time on. My colleague Meredith Rose did, and she got to testify before the Senate. We opposed that bill originally, and we really agreed with some of the goals and the values of the bill, that there were artists who were not being compensated for their work, they were being left out. But we introduced a new value to the conversation that allowed the bill to be modified in a positive way, and ultimately got Public Knowledge's support, and that was the importance of, in a digital world, that we could lose old, especially public domain art. And so we testified about that, and we brought examples, and we galvanized the archivists and the libraries community to talk about the importance of preserving our culture and our history, even beyond the value of folks being compensated for their work, and how that's an important balance in the values of copyright. And it held up the bill enough that we were able to get amendments included. So talking about values is extremely important. It can make reform better, and it can sharpen reform.
Great. I'm going to ask just one more general question for all of you, and then invite others to come up to the 2 microphones we have on either side if you want to give your own examples or ask further questions too. So part of the calculus, I think, in any kind of reform effort is to try to, I think, Chris, your example of timing in those particular contexts, I think the timing of drug price reform right now is sort of particularly interesting. So there's sort of a momentum timing kind of component there, but also the media and kind of like thinking about journalists as constituencies. There are, of course, journalists who would just print a quote because you said it, but there are some journalists or some media outlets who you kind of have to prove to them to some degree that what you're saying has merit behind it, or at least that it's an important point of view or something like that, right? And I was wondering if any of you wanted to comment on like what role or what kind of engagement with media matters or doesn't matter for these kinds of debates. There's obviously going to be coverage of something if it's hot, but is there a kind of way to think about, because obviously you're not in the same way that you would take it to a staffer or, in the court, a judge, or even a regulator, or, like the engineers inside the FCC, or, like economists are going to have a different kind of conversation than you're going to be able to have with journalists, right? So I just wondered if any of you wanted to comment on kind of the thinking around how do you then translate it into those kinds of constituencies and audiences who will then, in theory, take your message and communicate it further.
I mean, media is hugely important. I mean, particularly if you're thinking about legislative reform, but also executive action. And you know, I think we've had a lot of success in working with journalists who really do, who sometimes will have the luxury of spending weeks on a story and who really will talk to a lot of experts and try to really get the story right. I mean, one of the example that I just mentioned when I started of the government's CDC's patent on Truvada, you know, there's a big story in the Washington Post that broke that. There's a lot of work with that journalist ahead of time, getting that journalist comfortable with and providing technical analyses of the patents, because obviously the thing that the company says is that's a bad patent. So it really helps, and the journalist really wants to know, like, is there evidence that this patent in fact is good? And there is. So those kinds of things, actually, when the journalists have the time, you know, they really do. And I think one of the issues on our side is we don't have the time to work with journalists. I get calls from journalists several a week who want to talk and want, I think, to engage with people. But we're neither, I think, constitutively so well disposed to talk to the media on a constant basis, or just free to do it. And I think that's one of the things that I think centers and other kinds of academic institutions can probably help bridge a little bit of the gaps, but it's hard.
Well, just to add to that, I definitely would agree that the media plays an enormously important role as a shaper of the public's view, particularly about the intellectual property system, where it's not naturally something that the public finds easy to understand.
They don't wake up in the morning and read the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8? No.
Well, there's that issue, Jason, and then there's an even more fundamental issue, which is that, you know, people see the prices they're paying for today's drugs, and they naturally want the treatments that are in the marketplace today as inexpensively available as possible. There's, you know, terrific hindsight issue and a terrific amnesia problem. The question that journalists need to ask, and I think the better ones do ask, is for those diseases that haven't been cured, talk to the parents of the children who are suffering in hospital beds from those diseases and ask them how much they'd be willing to pay for a cure, and you get a much different answer than you do from the person who's talking about the disease that's already been cured and everyone's looking for the cheapest price. And so that's where the media, I think, has been increasingly playing a more positive role, asking the harder questions, requiring data, looking into things. I think I've seen a change for the better in that regard, particularly in the major media where they have, if you will, some luxury to be thoughtful and to study things. And at least my technique for dealing with the media is to have really long-standing relationships. Some of the key folks at the Times and the Journal and the Post, Bloomberg, et cetera, I've known for many years and tried, and not in the context of any story, but just in the context of the system generally. How is it doing? How is it failing? How is it succeeding? What needs to change up and down and sideways to have consistent ongoing relationships so these people have a long-term baseline and get a sense of confidence that they understand the direction.
Yeah, just to your point, real quick, the amount of investment that some of the major publications have made in data science teams and data teams and visualization teams too, I think has changed the way they tell stories. And so to some degree, the development of data and the capacity for journalists to report on data in various ways has also been interesting. But yeah, Chris, what about you?
No, I would totally agree. You know, I find that most journalists we talk to care about probably 2 or 3 different things. Number one is that data. If they can explain an issue well, they're serving the public well. Number 2 is just a creature, you know, being a creature of Washington, is the who's up, who's down. And it's strange how that factors in with the actual factual data of the policy. You know, the longer something drags on, the less reporters want to write about it because it's just not news to them, no matter how often they put the data in the article. And so, you know, the third thing is like this natural, because of that, the natural rhythm and momentum of policymaking is very important. And so, being able to demonstrate that not only do you have the data that backs up your argument, but that more and more people, hopefully because of the original articles that the journalists wrote, are understanding the importance of reform. And so showing growth, feeds that sense of momentum and gives, if you can find other stakeholders, other viewpoints to back up that data or to give a different anecdote, that can just be another story that builds on your momentum.
Great. Well, I always hate being the panel that holds people up before lunch, but if we have one or two questions, we'd be happy to take them, and then we can, of course, keep talking while we eat until we hear from Judge Chen.
I'd like to ask you more about the kind of rhythm parts of this, right? I'm sure all three of you have a number of reforms that you would imagine if you could just wave your hand and make them happen, you would do it. But there's a kind of a ripeness of when is the right moment to move towards a reform effort on any given topic. And so I'm curious to hear how you think about not just sort of proving the case once it's time to prove it, but when it's time to elevate an issue and start making a move to try and make that reform happen.
I mean, drug pricing example is a really interesting one because I do think there's some things that are changing in the world that are making that politically salient, and there are underlying structural things about like copays and how they work and stuff like that, and rising drug prices. But also behind the scenes, there's been a ton of work, in part from shifting of people who used to work more on international drug pricing issues to the domestic context. And there's been polling that's in fact been supported by sometimes like, foundations and things like that, but also just ordinary polling firms. There's been polling that helps elevate the issue so that it's not, I think when you get behind an issue, you'll see it doesn't organically rise to the surface. There's actually a fair amount of work based on some analysis that like now's a good, like this is a big problem and it's becoming a bigger problem and there's a political kind of, but that polling is tremendously influential. It helps drive policymakers, it helps drive the media's interest. And, when you can show that like 80% of Americans in a bipartisan way put this as one of their top issues for government, then that drives it to the surface. But that takes actually some work to produce, and in fact is interactive with all these things like getting stories out there in the media. And so like, I think there is the timing is hugely important. But also it can be influenced by the way that people actually produce data and produce analysis that can drive stuff to the surface.
I guess the one other comment I would add is that in the IP policy area where you're, say, trying to change the copyright or patent laws as examples, not driven by sort of the healthcare drug pricing debate, but driven by something like Section 101, the timeline is much, much longer, and you're thinking in terms of like a decade to get something like that done. So it's, in my experience, it's a matter of building the momentum in the constituency over a very significant period of time. There's some sense of waiting for moments and opportunities and things to come along, factual developments or policy developments or whatever that put wind in your sails, maybe just political timing, but there's an underlying, you got to take the first step before the second one, and it just takes a long time in the IP policy area.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would add there's just a tremendous amount of education of policymakers that takes time, and if you're not able to, if you aren't able to understand that you will have allies on an idea that people will understand why a reform is needed, then you're not ready to move forward. We spend a lot of time writing about things that probably won't be reformed at public knowledge, but we want to get those ideas out there and educate people on how technology could be used, or how policy could be altered to allow technology to be used in certain ways. But that really takes a long time to educate people, and then we also find that there's a change. There's a change in generations that's moving through Congress right now that's actually interested in entertaining some of these ideas, and so whether that leads to more reform will be interesting, because certainly after the 2011-2012 SOPA-PIPA fight, there was a sense that there's a group of people out there that care about copyright law that that members of Congress had not heard from before, and they were, I think, honestly scared to move on anything without upsetting that large group of American voters. But there's a new generation coming in that's willing to wrestle with the balance of the law in a way that hopefully will be constructive.
Yeah, good.
Transparency is a great thing, but I have a concern that with the rise of the digital economy and so much knowledge of what's actually happening and more transparency, that it's fueling the kind of populism that's making really good reform very difficult. And I think we see that across many areas, whether it's immigration or healthcare or social security system and so on. Focusing specifically on IP, in the world there is this movement, this anti-IP movement, I'll say, and it goes, David, really to the point you made, which is people want cheap drugs now, but they're not thinking about what does it take to actually produce the incentives and to produce the systems that are going to give us, great drugs. And it's true of in music and all of the other arts, so it's copyright, patent, it's some degree trademark as well. How do we help get the public around the understanding of these long-term benefits so that really good reform is possible instead of the populist reform that we're seeing? For example, just last week, the FDA issued a rule requiring pharmaceutical companies to include list pricing in their television advertising. I think that's going to actually do much more harm than good, and I see that and things like that as trying to appease this wave of populism instead of really improving the quality of our IP system.
Do you want to? Because you must hear this argument a lot, right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that I give the public more credit than that. I actually think around drug pricing issues, look, a lot of the examples we're talking about, there is not a good innovation argument at all, right? And so the public's not wrong that the price of insulin going up 400 times and the drugs haven't changed at all, doesn't have a lot of logic to it, right? But also, I think actually, one, the public can understand, and everybody who's sick understands the importance of developing new drugs. In fact, people in this country, I think, maybe overvalue new drugs. They have in bioethics, we call it the therapeutic misconception. People think that new drugs are going to do much more for them than they will. So I actually think it's a very complicated story about what the public understands about innovation and its drivers. And in fact, I think the public understands a fair amount, and there's sort of gaps on both sides. People overestimate what drugs are going to do for them and how much of a cure they're going to be, and they, overemphasize some of the time what the immediate, price barriers are. On the Trump thing, that's not a serious reform. I mean, nobody thinks that they're really trying to do anything. That's just the smallest thing that the Trump administration can do. And I think if you're, it's not really trying to drive any real policy change. I think deeper forms of transparency, if we knew more about R&D costs, it's just hard to make policy without knowing things like R&D costs and other things. And that's not really about what you put into a TV ad. It's about trying to understand the policymaking background and what to do to develop good policy to in fact adjudicate these interests. We do need transparency for those kinds of things to be better resolved, I think.
Okay.
So I'll just add a comment. My thinking is that the Academy can play a big role in this, and that the Academy needs to play a role of collecting and disseminating more data and stepping back from advocacy and instead stepping into a role of stewardship. And for instance, making clear that with respect to the insulin issue, while the prices have gone up a lot, it's not about intellectual property at all. There's a travesty there, but it's not about intellectual property. And anyone who's got that confusion in the halls of Congress, I hope Amy's telling them that, and I hope Chris is telling them that, and I hope others are as well, to be candid with them about, hey, look, if there are problems, don't blame them on your favorite scapegoat, the IP system. So I think this notion of collecting data, which this conference is about, I think is absolutely great. We need to do more of that. We need to get the data in front of Congress and in front of the decision makers and in front of the media. And we need to all be stewards about putting, if you will, the blame where the blame goes and not creating scapegoats.
So we'll take one last question. I just want to say one quick thing, though, which is the other thing, this kind of back and forth between industry and advocates who are non-industry, right? When I was doing a lot of work at EFF, we did find that the movie industry would put out studies that were not peer-reviewed where they claimed all the data was confidential trade secrets, so they would just put out the results of them. And so I do think that like one of the other things that is missing sometimes is kind of equal scrutiny on both sides of studies and things like that. So I do think that would help address some of these questions of what's real and what's not, if we had a little more transparency when industries put out studies, or at least that they're peer reviewed by people who are not paid by industry, things like that. So that's just one thing that I found to be sort of useful in that debate. But yeah, go ahead, Ed.
So this has been a very good discussion of strategic points about the messages and the like. I have a couple of questions about tactics, going back to SOPA. Now, SOPA did get defeated by the enormous groundswell of public opposition, but as I recall hearing that at one point the White House Chief of Staff asked for the CEOs of the technology companies to come to the White House to talk about it, and none showed up. That maybe a VP of government relations would show up, and there was a perception that the tech industry wasn't going to put itself out in that fashion. The CEOs wouldn't be bothered, whereas you know that Hollywood CEOs are going to show up multiple times. You know that the best-looking actors and actresses are going to show up, and the most popular singers are going to show up. And is that a failing, or was that just a blip because, after all, SOPA failed? Second question is it right to think in terms of campaigns for policy change? Is the game American football? The play happens, the clock stops, you can spend half a minute or however huddling and catching your breath, and then preparing for the next campaign, or is it really soccer, where the ball is always in motion? My fear is that one side is playing American football and the other side is playing soccer, and that's like playing checkers to chess. Well, is there validity in this, or am I sort of barking up the wrong tree? I'd love to get your thoughts.
If I could,
go.
no, I think that's a fair description. I could probably be a bit charitable to the tech executives. I think they've learned some of the lessons that you described. If you go back to 2011 and before that, I think a lot of the major tech companies just didn't have a presence in Washington and didn't understand the value of having a sustained presence in Washington. And you're seeing more of that now, and they're as they're coming under fire. They're seeing the benefit of having a presence and showing up, and bringing the executive. Unfortunately, I think it's more like soccer than it is like football, and the challenge, the challenge of populism that was brought up is, populism is only works in short bursts. And when there's real emergency. Otherwise, folks are pretty set living their lives. And so this is where I think values conversations are most important, having folks who are engaged in the continual policy debate, that are trusted, that actually tell the truth about studies, tell the truth about data, and can be proxies for the greater public. If we had honest conversations about data, if we had honest conversations about values, maybe you wouldn't have to see a populist alarm pulled so often on intellectual property law.
Yeah, one other thought I have, having been in D.C. and in the government when SOPA PIPA played out, I remember coming back to, I think, the question that Michael asked before, there was a tremendous groundswell that built up very quickly, and what happened within the administration and in the business community was people ran for the hills and made sure their fingerprints weren't on what was going on. And so I think probably what was going on was the VPs of government programs in Washington, D.C. were calling their CEOs up and saying, don't you dare come to Washington, D.C. You want nothing to do with this. Everyone went into damage control mode and, and tried to get out of the way of the thing. So that momentum, right, groundswell issue significantly played into what happened with SOPA and PIPA.
Just say one last thing, I guess, which is to say, from my perspective, we have less to worry about with populism as sort of people getting more involved in the political process than the opposite. And that's in part, you know, there's evidence for that, right? If you look at the work of Martin Gilens and others, it shows that, like, particularly poor people, or middle-class people even, like when they have policy preferences that diverge from elites, they don't get what they want, right? And that's in part because of the soccer game, right? And so and I think that there's a lot of examples that we could cite from the kind of field that we work in and lots of others where things that in fact there's lots of good evidence to say either, you know, we don't have a reason to do it this way or this is harming lots of people. They don't get changed. And so I feel like what's interesting about this moment is that there's more of an, you know, the Overton window, right? There's just more opportunity to make substantial arguments for change that those of us engaged in these issues have to come into to be constructive, as you say, figure out what's the right kind of change, but to also change the window of what we can talk about changing, right? So like on the innovation and pharma question, there's a lot of reason to think other models of innovation ought to be much more explored than they are, for example. That's not the kind of thing you get out of the game of soccer that we live in. That's what you get when suddenly you get a lot of Congress people focused because the political world has changed and constituents are demanding. They don't know exactly what they want, but they're demanding change. And we got to come in and provide the tools to say what kind of change that we bring.
Well, speaking of demands, I'm sure many of you are demanding lunch. So let me join me, please, in thanking the panel.